I never thought the day would come when I would have to share my story with the world. But sometimes silence isn't strength, it's surrender. My name is Alana, and I had been married to Marcus for over 17 years. We met in college, in one of those moments that feel like destiny. He was charming, intelligent, and had this calm presence about him that made me feel like everything in the world would be okay. For nearly 2 decades, I poured my heart into our marriage. We built a home, built careers, hosted family events, planned vacations, and lived a life that I thought was filled with mutual respect and love. Or so I believed. The cracks began to show subtly. He began working later hours, texting more often than before, and seemed emotionally absent at home. When I asked if something was wrong, he dismissed it with a smile and told me not to worry. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust the man I had promised forever to. But women know. There's a certain shift, a change in energy that words can't mask. One night, as he slept beside me, I looked at his phone. I know it wasn't right, but my gut screamed for answers. And there it was. Her name was Ava, 23 years old, a fresh graduate from the design firm he partnered with. The messages weren't just flirtatious, they were intimate, emotional, and deep. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply stared at the ceiling as the weight of betrayal sank in. Over the following week, I watched him make excuses to stay out late, lie to my face, and pretend like nothing was wrong. I documented everything. Screenshots, emails, voicemails. I played the long game. Then came our anniversary hour, 18th. A date we usually celebrated with weekend getaways or fancy dinners. I decided to host the dinner at home this time, claiming I wanted something more intimate. I made his favorite dishes, set the table for 3, and told him it was a surprise. He walked in with Ava, just as I suspected he might. The look on his face when he saw her name on the seating card was unforgettable. I welcomed them both warmly, like nothing was amiss. Ava looked uncomfortable, unsure of what was happening. Marcus was trying to read my face, waiting for the explosion. But there was none. Just wine, food, and calm conversation. I asked Ava about her dreams, her family, and her views on relationships. She was nervous at first but began to open up. That's when I placed the gift box on the table. For you both, I said. Inside were printed screenshots of their messages, a timeline of their affair, and legal documents with my attorneys. Letterhead. I smiled, lifted my wine glass, and said, "Happy anniversary, Marcus. You're free now." The silence that followed was thicker than the roast lamb on their plates. Ava stood up, whispering an apology. Marcus tried to speak, but I raised my hand and said, "No need." Everything that needed to be said was already written. I walked out of the room, left them at the table, and never looked back. The aftermath of that dinner became the quietest storm I had ever weathered. I sat alone in the bedroom that night, hearing the front door open and close ones for Ava, and hours later for Marcus. He didn't come upstairs. I imagine he couldn't. I imagined the guilt and the disbelief wrapped around him like a cloak he couldn't remove. The next morning, I found him on the couch, head in hands, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. I didn't say anything. I simply walked to the kitchen, brewed my coffee, and began making calls. The lawyer I had retained months ago was already in motion. Divorce filings were ready, assets traced, and the house's deed, my parents' gift, long been moved under my name in preparation. I was not going to let betrayal strip me of what I had earned with my dignity. Marcus followed me into the kitchen, his voice a faint whisper, asking why I didn't confront him sooner. I turned to him and said, "Because I wanted you to show me who you really are, and you did." He tried to apologize, said it was a mistake and that he never meant for it to go this far. I chuckled, not out of humor, but out of exhaustion. "You don't accidentally have a relationship, Marcus. That's not a trip on a sidewalk. That's a choice. Every text, every lie, every moment you looked me in the eye and said nothing." He cried. The kind of crying that's loud and ugly and full of self-loathing. But I had no comfort left to give him. My empathy had been drained, drop by drop over the past few months, and now, all that was left was resolve. Ava texted me later that day. Her message was long, apologetic, and filled with self-justification, how she didn't know he was still emotionally with me, how she felt manipulated too. I didn't reply. She didn't need closure. I did. I spent that day reclaiming spaces, removing pictures from frames, taking down his belongings, boxing everything that had his scent. I played music loud, not to dance, but to drown out the quiet questions echoing inside me. Was I not enough? Was my loyalty boring? Did my love age like milk to him while youth and novelty seduced his attention? But with each drawer I emptied, each memory I packed, I reminded myself that his failure was not my flaw. I began visiting a therapist shortly after, not because I was broken, but because I wanted to ensure I wouldn't carry this weight into my future. Betrayal can rot you from within if you let it fester. I didn't want to be bitter. I wanted to be better. During one of the sessions, my therapist asked what hurt me the most. It wasn't the cheating, surprisingly. It was the way he looked at her, the way he used to look at me. That quiet adoration, the awe, the attentiveness. It made me realize how far we had drifted and how blind I had been, thinking I could row a marriage alone while he had already jumped ship. In the weeks that followed, Marcus tried to stay in the house, claiming he needed to figure things out. I calmly reminded him that the house wasn't his anymore, and that figuring things out didn't include camping in a place he had already emotionally vacated. The locks were changed a week later, not as a punishment but as a boundary, one he had crossed too many times already. There was a strange kind of power in reclaiming silence, not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of decisions already made. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't perform heartbreak for anyone to witness. I simply moved. I moved forward like someone who had already mourned what was lost months before it officially ended. I think that's what confused Marcus the most. Not the divorce, not the exposure, not the legal action, but the calm. He was expecting rage, and maybe he was even prepared for it. But he wasn't prepared for indifference. People like him thrive on reactions, good or bad, because reactions give them relevance. But when you take away the response, they are forced to sit with their own echo. Ava eventually stopped texting. I didn't block her. I wanted her to see that I wasn't hiding, that she wasn't dangerous to me, and that her presence in my life had already expired. The community around us began to learn what happened, slowly, not because I told them, but because stories this messy rarely stay private. Some of our mutual friends tried to stay neutral, but neutrality in betrayal is just cowardice dressed as diplomacy. I stopped responding to their check-ins. If you don't know who you're standing with when someone burns down your life, then I don't need your shadow in my sunrise. I focused instead on rebuilding things Marcus had tried to subtly make me doubt over the years. My confidence, my independence, my beauty. He never said anything cruel directly, but he would always suggest alternatives. Maybe don't wear that. Or are you sure you can handle this by yourself? Or you don't really need to go out with your friends tonight, do you? Death by 1,000 cuts disguised as concern. And slowly, I had given pieces of myself away in the name of compromise. Now, I was collecting every shard and gluing myself back together with gold. I booked a solo trip to Portugal, a place I'd always wanted to see but kept postponing for couples' vacations or family schedules. I wandered down cobbled streets, drank espresso in quiet cafes, and stood on cliffs overlooking the ocean, realizing how small one man's betrayal looked next to the vastness of my rediscovered peace. On one of those days, I wrote a letter to Marcus, but to myself. I wrote the kind of letter I would want to read if I ever doubted my worth again. I reminded myself of the strength it takes not to scream but to walk away, of the courage it takes to love someone without losing yourself, and of the resilience required to stand back up after someone tried to reduce your value to their convenience. When I returned home, I framed that letter and hung it in my closet where I could read it every morning, not because I needed daily affirmations, but because I needed to remember how far I'd come when I was tempted to settle for less ever again. Marcus eventually moved into a small apartment across town. I heard through a mutual friend that things with Ava didn't last. I wasn't surprised. Relationships built on lies often collapse under the weight of their own guilt. And more than that, Ava was not the villain. She was just a chapter. The real betrayal came from the man who had stood in front of me with vows and promises and years of shared life, only to let novelty outweigh loyalty. But I wasn't writing a story of revenge. I was writing a story of release, letting go of who I was with him to become who I had always been without him. Months passed, and each day felt lighter than the last. I wasn't just healing, I was transforming. My home began to reflect the new version of me. I repainted walls, moved furniture, and created corners of comfort where memories of Marcus used to linger like shadows. There was a time when the scent of his cologne on a forgotten jacket would make me pause, close my eyes, and fall into a spiral of what ifs and whys. But now, the scent faded and so did the attachment. I replaced the photos on the hallway wall with pictures from my Portugal trip, candid shots of sunsets, street art, and my smile, my real smile, the one not worn for someone else's comfort. The kind of smile that isn't measured by another person's approval. At work, I took on projects I had once declined out of fear of stretching myself too thin, or worse, making Marcus feel less important. Turns out, I was damn good at what I did. Promotions came. Recognition followed. But more than anything, I felt proud. Not just because I was succeeding, but because I was no longer shrinking myself to fit someone else's definition of balance. One rainy Thursday evening, I bumped into Marcus at a grocery store. He looked thinner, tired, with a slight beard that didn't suit him. He was buying instant noodles and a six-pack of beer. Ionic, given how he used to scoff at processed food. We exchanged a brief nod. No words. He looked at me like he wanted to say something, maybe even apologize again. But he didn't, and I didn't offer any invitation. Closure wasn't a conversation, it was the peace I already had. After he left, I remember standing in the aisle for a moment longer, hands still resting on a box of herbal tea, smiling to myself, not because I was happy he was miserable, but because I was free from needing anything from him anymore, not even an apology. That night, I posted a picture of myself holding a glass of wine on the balcony, captioned with a line that had become my quiet mantra: "Some endings are beginnings in disguise." The comments poured in. Old friends, coworkers, even distant cousins wrote about how proud they were of me, how inspired they felt. But one message stood out. It was from a woman I didn't know. She wrote, "Thank you for sharing this. I just discovered my husband is cheating. Your strength gave me hope tonight." And just like that, my pain had purpose. I realized that sometimes we live through the fire, not just to survive it but to light the way for someone else. That's when I decided to write everything down, not just my story, but the silent battles so many women fight behind closed doors, quiet compromises, the emotional erasures, the desperate attempts to hold together what's already broken. I began drafting chapters at night, pouring years of suppressed truths into paragraphs. It was therapy in ink. By the end of the year, I had a manuscript, and by spring, I had a book deal. The title, Dinner for Three: How I Served Truth Cold. It became a modest success, but more than the sales or the publicity, it brought me messages from women all over the world. Some cried, some cheered, some left their own Marcus behind after reading my story. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't ruin his life. I just rebuilt mine so beautifully that he had to sit and watch a garden grow from the ashes he left behind. The book's success took on a life of its own. I started getting invitations to speak at book clubs, women's conferences, podcasts, all from people who had been touched by my story. At first, I was hesitant. I'm not a performer, not someone who enjoys a spotlight. I was just a woman who got hurt, took a deep breath, and chose not to shatter. But when I stood on that first stage and looked into the eyes of dozens of women who had lived through versions of the same betrayal, I knew I had found something bigger than myself. My pain had become a bridge. After one event, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She told me how her husband had left her with 3 kids and no explanation. She said she kept my book hidden in her pillowcase and read it every night, like a Bible. "You helped me leave," she whispered. I hugged her tightly, both of us crying without shame. It hit me then sometimes. Surviving is enough. But if you're brave enough, surviving can become a revolution. I started writing more essays, blogs, anonymous columns for women's magazines. I never bashed Marcus by name. I didn't need to. The story wasn't about him anymore. It was about resilience. It was about rising. One day, while checking my email, I saw something unexpected. A message from Marcus. The subject line, "Owe you more than an apology." I sat still for a moment, staring at it. My first instinct was to delete it. I didn't need anything from him. But curiosity lingered, not out of hope, but out of closure that was now entirely in my hands. Opened it. It was long. He wrote about how losing me had opened his eyes, how Ava had left within weeks, how he realized too late what he had destroyed. He said he still read about me online, watched my interviews, and never expected me to turn pain into purpose. Way I did. He apologized not just for cheating, but for every moment he made me feel small. "I never deserved you," he wrote. But I needed you to know I finally see that now. I read the message twice, maybe 3 times. Then I closed the laptop, stood up, and went outside to water my plants. The flowers I had nurtured over the last year were blooming bright, defiant, alive, just like me. I never replied to his email, not because I was angry, but because I no longer needed him to validate the version of me I had become. Some people are chapters, and some chapters don't deserve sequels. In the months that followed, my story was picked up by a small indie production company. They wanted to turn it into a limited series. I laughed at first, me, on TV, but they weren't asking me to act. They wanted the rights to the story, and they wanted me as a consultant. The script stayed loyal to my experience, raw and honest. Watching actors play out the scene of that anniversary dinner, the awkward silence, the glass of wine, the box of truth, I felt oddly detached. It was like watching someone else's life. And maybe, in a way, it was. That version of me, the woman holding it together for a man who had long left the room emotionally, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, smarter, and softer. In the right places. Healing hadn't hardened me. It had polished me. By the time the show aired, I had moved into a new place, a smaller home, but all mine. The walls were painted in colors I loved. The shelves were filled with books I chose. The closet held only clothes that made me feel good. There were no ghosts here, just peace. I hosted dinners, not anniversaries, not revenge plots, just evenings filled with laughter and friends and wine and music. And sometimes, I'd look at the extra seat at the table and smile. Not because I missed him, but because I did in single quotes, by the time a full year had passed since that unforgettable anniversary dinner. I was no longer measuring my life by what I had lost, but by what I had gained. Peace, clarity, self-worth, the kind of inner strength that can't be taught, only earned through fire. I no longer woke up with a pit in my stomach, wondering if I was good enough, beautiful enough, interesting enough, to keep a man beside me. That weight, the constant emotional labor of managing someone else's fragility, had lifted. And what a glorious relief it was to simply exist without walking on eggshells. People started asking me if I was ready to date again. It's funny how society assumes that the solution to one broken relationship is another one, as if a woman alone is somehow incomplete, waiting for the next man to save her from her solitude. But I wasn't lonely. Not even close. I had learned how to sit with myself in silence and be content. I'd spend evenings reading by candlelight, journaling, cooking elaborate meals just for me, and every time I plated a dish with care, I reminded myself, I am worth effort even if I'm the only one putting it in. Still, curiosity about love lingered at the edges of my mind, not a craving, but a curiosity. What would it be like to connect again, this time without compromising my identity? So, I made a dating profile. Not flashy, not desperate, just honest. I listed what I loved: long walks, foreign films, quiet cafes, loud laughter, and conversations that don't rush to conclusions. I didn't post glamorized photos or curated lies. I didn't want someone to fall in love with a facade. I wanted someone who saw the cracks and admired the way I held myself together anyway. I matched with a man named Elliot. His bio was simple: divorced, book lover, once broke a toe chasing a dog I was trying to rescue. We'll explain over coffee. I smiled. It wasn't trying too hard. It was human. Our first coffee date was at a small cafe downtown. He arrived on time, held the door open, and complimented my scarf. Not my dress, not my body, my scarf. That alone told me something. Conversation flowed like we had known each other for years. He didn't ask about my ex. He asked about my writing, about what kind of music made me cry, about the most peaceful place I had ever visited. When I told him about Portugal, his eyes lit up. I've never been, he said, but I've always wanted to stand on the edge of a cliff and feel the sea wind smack me in the face. I laughed. That's oddly specific, I said. And a little poetic, he shrugged. Pain makes poets out of all of us, doesn't it? We sat for 3 hours, and when we parted ways, he didn't ask to see me again. He just said, I hope the next time we meet, you'll tell me what you wrote in that letter you framed. I hadn't told him I framed it. Somehow, he just knew. Over the next few weeks, we met again slowly, gently, no grand gestures, numbered, rushed declarations. Just small moments, stacked one on top of the other. He respected my space, didn't try to fix me, didn't romanticize my pain. He just sat with it when I let him, like someone holding a hand out without expecting it to be taken. One evening, he asked if I ever regretted inviting Marcus and Ava to that dinner. I thought about it, really thought about it. No, I said, I think it was the most honest thing I've ever done. I didn't do it to hurt them. I did it to close a chapter, loudly, publicly, so I could never reopen it again. Elliot nodded. That's the kind of clarity most people spend a lifetime avoiding. I smiled. I didn't know where things with Elliot were going, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to define it. Love, I realized, doesn't always have to look like forever. Sometimes, it just has to look like healing. The air at the table was heavier than before, as if the candle flames flickering between us were trying to signal something more profound than just ambience. Martin shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers nervously toying with his fork, while Jasmine maintained that same polished smile, though now her eyes darted toward me more often, betraying the crack forming beneath her poise. I leaned forward slightly, just enough to appear genuinely engaged, and said, "So Jasmine, I heard you're into interior design. That must be ... enlightening." She blinked at the tongue gentle, yet Leodan replied with a cautious nod, launching into a description of a recent high-end project. Her words were fine, eloquent even, but they fell into a hollow rhythm. I wasn't listening to her stories. I was listening to Martin's silence. He barely interjected, not even offering his usual affirmations. Something about the dynamic was subtly shifting, and I could sense it. Then I reached down beside me and brought up a wrapped box, our old anniversary ritual, and passed it to Martin. "It's our special tradition," I said softly. "You didn't think I'd forget, did you?" He hesitated, almost dreadfully, and then unwrapped it in front of both of us. Inside lay a framed photo collage, pictures of our trips, family dinners, our wedding, each one painstakingly curated and printed on thick, glossy paper, bordered with the words, "Our story, until you changed the ending." Martin's hands froze on the frame. Jasmine leaned over slightly to look, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker in her eyes. It wasn't a picture. It was a mirror, and they were both seeing something they hadn't expected. Martin slowly placed the frame down, cleared his throat, and forced a chuckle. "You always did have a flair for drama, and you always had a flair for rewriting the truth," I responded calmly, reaching for my wine. "But I figured I'd show it how it really was, how it is." There was a beat of silence, too sharp to ignore. The waiter approached to ask if we were ready for dessert, but the question hung unanswered, ignored, because dessert was already being served, bit by bit, in bitter truths and slowly unraveling pretenses. Jasmine's voice, so previously vibrant and assertive, had dropped to almost a whisper. "You never mentioned any of this," she said to Martin, her eyes not leaving the collage on the table. Martin looked cornered, the kind of trapped expression one wears when their constructed reality starts falling apart in front of witnesses. "What was I supposed to say?" he snapped, his voice barely above a mutter. "That I was married to someone who gave everything and still got left behind." The waiter silently refilled our water glasses, no doubt sensing the rising tension. I didn't flinch. I was prepared for this. I had known the moment would come where all the revisionist narratives Martin had spun for Jasmine would collide with the facts I had weaponized tonight. "No, Martin," I said gently. "You weren't supposed to say anything. You were supposed to remember." I reached into my purse and pulled out a second box, this one smaller, lined with velvet. "Do you remember this?" I asked. Jasmine's eyes were wide now, darting between us. Martin opened it. Inside was the watch I had gifted him on our 10th anniversary, custom, engraved with the words, "Forever, no matter what." "You said you'd never take it off," I added. "But it ended up at the back of our junk drawer the day after you met her." Jasmine's expression shifted again, confusion mingling with the first hints of betrayal. "You kept all this?" she asked me. "Why, not to hold on," I said, "but to remind myself who I was before he made me question it." There it was, the rupture, the slow detonation of the evening's plan beginning to unravel, in exactly the way I'd intended. No yelling, no throwing wine glasses, just the clinical, precise exposure of a man who thought he could rewrite the past and walk away unscathed. Martin leaned back, defeated. Jasmine looked at him as though for the first time. The silence between them spoke louder than anything I could have planned. He stood at the edge of the room, awkwardly clutching a half-empty wine glass, trying to pretend like everything was normal. But the tension in the air was thicker than the expensive gravy drizzled on the filet mignon. I could see him whispering to Rachel, his new, younger trophy, who looked every bit the image of youthful perfection he'd apparently wanted. I had to suppress the rolling wave of emotion that threatened to take over again, the embarrassment, the rage, and the heartbreak all dancing behind my smile. But I had prepared for this moment meticulously. From the seating chart to the wine selection, every detail was part of a greater plan. My friends from college were seated near Rachel, and they were already subtly throwing verbal darts, masked in pleasant conversation. I had ensured that Rachel would be surrounded by people who excelled in the art of backhanded compliments. "Oh, you're in marketing," one of my friends chimed with a honeyed voice. "That's so sweet. It must be so refreshing to just start out. We used to love our internships, too." Rachel smiled tightly, visibly uncomfortable, but trying to keep up appearances. Meanwhile, I gave a toast, my voice calm and gracious, thanking everyone for coming to celebrate a love story with so many chapters. I deliberately glanced at him and then at her. The silence that followed was enough to raise eyebrows. As I continued, I slowly unfolded layers of our story: triumphs, betrayals, reconciliations, anecdote carefully chosen not to reveal the affair directly, but to point the audience toward the cracks that had formed long before Rachel entered the picture. The room began to stir with murmurs and exchanged glances, the weight of implications heavier than the wine in their glasses. The real twist, though, was just beginning. I had something for dessert that wasn't on the menu, something far more unforgettable than creme brulee. I stood at the sink, scrubbing dishes harder than necessary, pretending not to hear the conversation from the living room where Mark and Jenna sat. The silence between their voices was louder than any yelling. I could tell they were uncomfortable, and I reveled in it. Every detail of tonight was calculated not out of pettiness, but from years of suppressed pain. This was not a display of revenge, but of revelation. I wanted them to see the woman Mark had discarded and realize what they had mistaken for weakness was, in fact, measured strength. When I returned to the room, I carried desserts, his favorite tiramisu, homemade like I always made on our anniversary. I watched his expression shift, not from joy, but from guilt. Jenna tried to smile, awkward and forced, the tension wrapping around her like a noose. I told them I never stopped loving this day because it marked the beginning of a promise. Mark looked down, unable to meet my eyes. "Too bad one of us forgot the promise," I added softly, but loud enough for it to pierce. They sat in silence, unsure how to respond. Then I shifted the conversation, asking Jenna about her career and her dreams, treating her not like a rival, but like a woman who didn't yet understand the weight of the man she now held. She spoke hesitantly, surprised by my civility. I listened, nodding, and when she finished, I told her calmly. "He once said the same things about me, about how he admired my ambition, loved my spirit." Mark's face turned a shade redder. I wasn't just talking to them, I was showing them the whole truth. I was making sure that what he left behind wasn't just a memory, it was a lesson. The power in that room no longer belonged to the one who cheated, nor to the one who followed it, belonged to the one who stayed strong in the storm, and lit the match that made them both squirm in their comfort. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, flashes of that dinner, the candlelight, the way he looked at her when he thought I wasn't watching. Her nervous laughs flooded my mind, like waves crashing against a fragile dam. My therapist had once told me that pain is just unprocessed reality. And now I was sitting in the heart of it, alone, processing every glance, every word, every silence. And yet, instead of curling into that pain and staying down, something strange happened. I sat up in bed and opened my journal. I began writing down everything I had been through, not for him, not for anyone else, but for me. I wrote about the years I gave, the love I poured, the disappointments I tucked away, the sacrifices that turned invisible. Then I wrote about the anniversary dinner, the awkward tension, the sharp-edged silences, and the smiles that never touched the eyes. As I wrote, the pain transformed into clarity. This dinner hadn't broken me, it had freed me. I realized I had stayed too long in a marriage that had stopped serving both of us. I had begged for attention when I should have demanded respect. I had romanticized loyalty at the cost of my own happiness, and now I had nothing left to prove. The following morning, I booked a solo trip to the coast. No explanations, no guilt. I stood at the shoreline, letting the wind braid itself into my hair, the salt sting my skin, It was the first time in years I felt alive. And as the waves crashed before me, I smiled not because I had moved on, but because I had finally come back to myself. As I sat in the quiet of my room that night, the echoes of dinner still bouncing off the walls of my mind, I replayed every glance, every awkward silence, every nervous laugh that had filled the air when I raised the toast. They hadn't expected that. My calm, my poise, my decision to invite them both to the table of what was supposed to be a celebration of the life we had built together. And while it may have seemed like a petty move to some, to me, it was closure on my terms. I had spent far too long living in the shadows of someone else's expectations, shrinking myself down so he could feel larger. Now, I was done. I remembered the flash of red that rose to his cheeks when I told the story of our first anniversary, how he had forgotten it entirely. And I had lied to my friends to cover for him. I didn't tell it to humiliate him, but to remind myself of just how many times I had excused his apathy and confusion for love. His new partner shifted uncomfortably in her seat as I spoke. And in that moment, I saw the first hint of reality etching itself into her youthful confidence. Maybe she was starting to realize that if he could toss aside years of shared life for something new, what made her think she wouldn't be next in line someday? But I didn't pity her. I had been her once, full of hope, blind to warning signs, convinced love alone was enough. I didn't need revenge. I needed liberation. And inviting them both was not about rekindling anything or seeking validation. It was to take back a day that had once meant something beautiful to me, and transform it into a declaration of my strength. When I raised my glass and said, "Two endings that make room for better beginnings," I wasn't speaking to them. I was speaking to the woman I had buried under years of sacrifice, silence, and swallowed pain, the one who was finally clawing her way out. As they left, he didn't look back. Neither did I. The silence between us was no longer painful. It was freeing. And I knew that whatever came next, it would be on my terms. I sat at the table in stunned silence, blinking back the whirlwind of emotions surging through me. The room was filled with soft clinks of cutlery and awkward murmurs, but inside my chest, a storm was raging. Across from me, Mark's new girlfriend, who had the audacity to wear white, was giggling at something he said. The sparkle in her eyes, so artificial, so rehearsed, didn't match the depth I once saw in his when he looked at me. He never even glanced in my direction. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was pride. Whatever it was, he was choosing to pretend that this dinner wasn't an emotional ambush. I leaned back slightly, my fingers gripping the wineglass stem, and let the words in my head come together into a sharp but graceful speech I had rehearsed silently for weeks. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my power. Everyone in that room, our mutual friends, his parents, my siblings, needed to hear the truth, not the sugar-coated version Mark had fed them. I tapped my glass lightly with a fork and cleared my throat. Conversations died down. All eyes turned to me. I smiled, an elegant, deliberate smile that hid all the fire burning behind it. "Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight," I began, my voice steady but laced with undeniable emotion. "It means the world to celebrate an anniversary, especially one that has revealed so much truth." Mark stiffened. The girl beside him tensed. "This dinner isn't just about a date we marked on the calendar for years. It's about acknowledging the ending of an era and the beginning of something new. Because tonight, I'm finally closing the chapter on a lie I lived for far too long." Audible gasps rose around the table. I stood up, allowing my eyes to settle on each person in turn. Mark and I built a life together, but while I was planning our future, he was planning his escape with someone younger. Yes, but not smarter. I looked directly at her, not stronger, and certainly not kinder. She shrank into her seat. Mark opened his mouth but didn't speak. I wasn't done. Not yet. I don't share this to humiliate anyone. I share this because silence allows betrayal to grow in the shadows. I share this because I want to thank those who stayed by me when I had nothing left but the truth. And I share this because this is my celebration too. Not of a failed marriage, but of a woman who finally found the strength to walk away from someone who never deserved her in the first place. A hush fell over the room. I felt the tears pooling, but I didn't let them fall. I raised my glass to freedom, to self-respect, and to the beautiful life I'm about to begin. Glasses slowly raised in awkward unison, but I didn't care. That toast wasn't for them. It was for me. I had taken my pain and turned it into power, and They all saw it, especially him. I stood in front of the mirror that night, looking at myself long and hard, wondering how I had arrived at this strange juncture in my life, where the woman who was once the love of his life now had to sit across the table from him, and the one he replaced me with. My thoughts swirled with confusion and clarity all at once, a painful symphony of self-realization that refused to quiet down. There was something quietly poetic about what I was doing. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't closure. It wasn't even a cry for attention. It was simply a confrontation with the raw truth, his truth, my truth, and maybe even hers. As the clock ticked closer to the dinner hour, I lit candles in the dining room, turned down the lights, and allowed the soft glow to bathe the room in a golden warmth. The house, though lonely in recent months, had not lost its charm. I set the table meticulously, every plate and glass positioned perfectly, the way he always liked. I poured a glass of red wine and allowed myself a single sip before they arrived, not to relax, but to remember who I was before all this. When the doorbell rang, I did not hesitate. I walked calmly to the door, opened it, and smiled. There they stood, him in a crisp blazer, trying too hard to look unbothered, and her in a bodycon dress that screamed insecurity rather than confidence. The moment they stepped inside, the tension thickened. I greeted them with a smile so genuine that it confused them. She kept glancing at me, unsure how to interpret my poise. He looked around the house as if searching for traces of our past, which still lingered on the walls, in the photos, and in the furniture. I invited them to sit, poured the wine, and served the appetizer. We began with small talk, her voice overly sweet, his attempts at humor falling flat. But I remained composed, charming, and attentive, never once flinching at the awkwardness, pressing down on the table like an invisible guest. And then I leaned forward with the smile of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to reveal. I told them a story, one they didn't expect, one about a woman who had been blindsided by love, who gave everything and got nothing in return. A woman who realized too late that the man she had built a home with had started checking out long before he walked away. And just as their faces began to freeze in discomfort, I raised my glass and said, "To the truth, to knowing what we deserve, to no longer pretending." I toasted with them, though they barely lifted their glasses, eyes wide, unsure what was coming next. The day after the anniversary dinner, the dust of the chaos had settled, but the tremors were still being felt everywhere. My phone buzzed, nonstop messages from friends, relatives, even strangers online who had seen the viral clip from the restaurant, courtesy of someone who'd recorded the moment Paul stormed out, and Carla's meltdown that followed. I had no part in making it public, but I didn't hide from it either. My story was out now, and instead of shame, I felt a strange kind of power blooming inside me. Carla tried to defend herself online with a teary post about being tricked, but public sentiment didn't swing her way. Meanwhile, Paul disappeared from social media entirely. I, however, was just beginning. I did an interview with a podcast that focused on women reclaiming their lives, and it was liberating to speak my truth without filters or fear. I also started a support group, Anniversaries of Strength, for others who'd gone through betrayal and needed a space to rebuild. I'd rented a small studio near the beach where we could meet weekly, surrounded by the smell of salt and hope. Each week, I shared a new part of my journey, and others shared theirs. We cried, laughed, sometimes screamed, but mostly, we healed. Strangely enough, I even reconnected with an old high school friend who reached out after watching the viral dinner video. His message was simple: you didn't deserve what happened, but the way you handled it, that was legendary. We met for coffee, then dinner, then beach walks that turned into deep conversations. I didn't rush into anything romantic. My heart was still cautious, but it was nice to be seen again, fully and kindly. Months passed. Paul never tried to come back, and that was the biggest gift he unknowingly gave me: silence. Carla moved to another state, from what I heard, but my life, once orbiting around others' needs, was now rooted in purpose, clarity, and self-worth. I no longer wondered why it all happened. I knew, because sometimes life breaks you apart just enough to show you how strong you've always been.